All right, everyone. So this week, one of the big topics is tourism and development. So in addition to the online material, there's this screencast. Here's a picture. This is a very famous tourist site. It's Latin America's probably the biggest waterfall. It's Falls de Iguazu. It's a waterfall that exists on the kind of border between Brazil and Argentina, and then the border with Paraguay is not too far away. Pretty neat site if you ever get a chance to go. It's the site of a couple pretty big Hollywood movies, including The Mission, which is a really interesting one about missionaries, Catholic missionaries in colonial Brazil. And then also it's kind of the setting for the computer animation sequence in the most recent Indiana Jones movie. Whether you like that movie or not, it is a pretty impressive site. Definitely worth checking out if you ever have the chance, if you ever find yourself in the southern cone of Latin America. Anyway, when we talk about tourism, probably the first thing is to remember that, tourism isn't a binary thing. There's a lot of different types of tourism, and only some of them include, going to Cancun for spring break. Believe it or not, the cultural / kind of social tourism is among the most popular types of tourism in Latin America. And that's what you get when you go to Italy to wine, dine, and see classic architecture, what you do when you go to celebrate Carnival in Rio, right? This is cultural, social tourism. It's not necessarily just go to a beach and, lay there kind of tourism. Economic tourism is popular as well. This is kind of a weird one. What's economic tourism? Well, it's visiting companies, development projects, things like that. And it's actually a kind of a really cool thing to do. Although, understandably, given who I am as a, university professor or whatever, I would probably find this cooler than some people might. Seriously though, it's kind of neat when you get to go do something like visit the biggest chocolate producer in South America and get a tour that involves all you can eat chocolate, right? Who would turn that down? This includes tours of big development projects like dams, which, not as weird as it sounds, believe it or not, they're pretty fascinating feats of engineering, factories, mines, things like that. And then environmental tourism is another big deal. It's one of my favorite, and it's actually one of the biggest industries globally in terms of tourism. And that's because adventure tourism falls in here. So does ecotourism, safaris, canoeing, camping, surfing. I mean, these all sound like leisure activities, and they're really pretty important. So basically, environmental tourism includes anything you need the natural environment to do, and that even includes going to the beach. So environmental tourism is pretty popular, right? Latin America is a very large and growing tourist destination for global tourism, and we're going to see a lot of it in today's screencast. There are two really kind of main important types: ecotourism and mass tourism. They're kind of there's some distinguishing characteristics between the two. It's also important to know that tourism is growing globally, and it's not a stranger to Latin America. And there is a real tension between these two types, ecotourism and mass tourism, in Latin America and also in Asia and Africa. Now, tourism is something you do, sure. It's an activity. We've all been tourists, right? Going up north, people say in Michigan, for example, going to the beach. But tourism, requires planning and time. It's definitely something with a discrete beginning and an end. And as much as, people from areas that see a lot of tourism, like, some of the nearby counties around Vigo County right now, with usually this time of year, there's at least in the fall, in October, there's the Covered Bridge Festival. The people, I'm sure, are cursing out tourism or tourists, but, it's pretty important, right? We all go to the beach. Maybe we stayed a week or two at a cottage or a resort, and we were tourists then. We're a tourist at some point in our life, pretty much, especially if you're in the U.S. and you come from a family that's not absolutely living in abject poverty. Tourism isn't just beaches, and this is something that we kind of forget about. People become tourists doing all kinds of things. If you're a hang glider, part of the time you're actually doing tourism. Trekking or hiking is tourism. Biking can be tourism. Eating and drinking at our favorite restaurants can even count as tourism if we're doing that in a place that's new to us. There are even people who like to do things like go visit impoverished areas for tourism. A good example of this is favela tours, slum tours in Rio. There are companies that will take you through favelas on walking and driving tours, and they're kind of disturbing in some ways because they're kind of a part of an increasing interest in tourism that involves looking at poverty. For example, in this country we have Appalachia, and as a region, Appalachia is a notoriously poor area. And, it happens that one of my relatively well-off friends lives in Western Virginia. Okay, not West Virginia, but Western Virginia. And she actually had a tourist couple stop, get out of their car, and take a photo of her while she was sitting on her front porch because they thought that she looked like an Appalachian person. And she was. But my friend actually felt a little bit offended by the audacity of such a move. Stop, pull over your car, don't even say hello, take a picture of me, right? And that's kind of, it's easy to imagine how somebody in that Latin American slum might react in a similar manner. And all the more so when it turns out that people have a real pride in their community and place, even in slum or auto-constructed areas, right? So anyway, tourism isn't just beaches, and it does have some troubling aspects. Everybody gets annoyed at tourism at some point or another, but it's also a pretty important economic activity. And that's the other part of this emphasis here, that tourism is an industry. It generates an enormous amount of wealth, lots of cash, right? Companies and people get wealthy participating in the industry of tourism. It employs a lot. Not only in the lesser developed world, but in the developed world as well. It can be such a moneymaker that many state governments throughout the world, here's an example of the Mexican state of Chihuahua, they do everything they can to encourage tourism. Our neighboring state in Michigan, because of tourism, they passed a law to mandate that elementary K through 12 schools couldn't start the school year until after Labor Day, which would give an extra weekend of the summer essentially for tourism to take place. One of our other neighbors, Illinois, spends as much as $48 million a year into encouraging tourism, a lot of it to the Chicagoland area. And in many states there will be over 100,000 people engaged in the tourism trade, right? In Latin America, tourism is huge, both in terms of resort tourism and tourism that happens on a more individual basis. From 2005, I wasn't able to gather newer information, but according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, the expectation was that tourism was going to grow around just shy of 5% per year between 2005 and 2017. 1 in every 12 jobs globally in 2005 was related to tourism, and nearly 4% of all government expenditures across the globe could be linked to tourism. So, that's a big chunk of money. It's one of the world's largest industries in terms of economic production, 11%, and 8% of global employment directly in tourism. Tourism not only is a big industry, but it's grown incredibly since the 1950s. So if we proxy, that would be use a variable that could represent tourism, like international tourist arrivals, okay? We see steady growth between 1950 and 1999. And there are a bunch of reasons for this, but one, some of them include greater overall wealth globally, easier transportation, cheaper transportation, and increased awareness of cool places to visit. And you can think of this trend here as displaying the number of tourists being tourists. So that would be the activity of tourism. On the other hand, we can also think about the economy of tourism. So the industry of tourism has grown similarly, phenomenally over the same period, where, by 2000, in standardized 1998 dollars, there was, $450 billion being spent on tourism globally. So the amount of wealth generated by tourism is enormous. The drivers of this increase are largely the same. We would consider a number of these. One, improved labor conditions, right? Especially the shorter work week, which have come from the spread of better labor practices throughout the more developed and less developed world alike. There are also a greater number of holidays, and a lot of these are paid in many cases. Incomes continue to rise in many countries, which means that international tourism has become viable for many. So even between 1995 and 2005, the number of people in Latin America who themselves are able to become international tourists has grown incredibly. At the national level here in the U.S. and elsewhere, because of increased wealth and higher income, people are more able to move around within a country and be a tourist domestically. Advances in transportation have been a big increase in tourism, or a big factor in increasing tourism. Used to be, or today, you can get from Buenos Aires, Argentina, to New York or back. It's about a 13-hour flight. So if you left from Indianapolis tomorrow morning, first thing, it would get you, you could get to Buenos Aires in about 13 hours, nonstop flight from New York, right? Dial back the calendar, in 1925 it would take a month to get to Buenos Aires from here, from central Indiana. In 1950 you could do it faster, it'd take about a week. And that would be flying, and you would stop every few hours to refuel, change aircraft, whatever, because the range in aircraft wasn't as big as it is today. Another advance has been the availability of information. So if we think about, the proliferation of information, we can find tourist information just by logging onto the internet. And so a lot of travel magazines and travel sections of major newspapers really focus on remote destinations and lesser known destinations because people have discovered that they're kind of cooler to visit. They're a little bit more pleasant. You don't have to deal with so many obnoxious tourists, even though you yourself might be an obnoxious tourist. So instead of info about visiting Paris or Antigua or, Rome, we see stuff in newspapers about Mongolia, South Africa, the Philippines, Bolivia instead of Rio. If we look at kind of the last few weeks of the New York Times in June, when I was putting this information together, 2 weeks of New York Times coverage on tourism, you see articles about Belize, Thailand, Latvia, Brazil, and Nepal. Almost half of the destinations that were featured were pretty exotic places, really, places that people don't generally visit as tourists. At least your parents probably didn't think of visiting as tourists. So all of these factors combined to bring about an increased desire for tourism to new places, right? It's cool to be able to say, well, I went to this really neat new place that nobody knows about, right? In Latin America, tourism is very significant. It's a big deal, but there are some places where tourism is more significant in global tourism than in others. So if we check this out, it's very clear that Mexico dwarfs everyone, with nearly 4 times as much tourist activity than the next country in Latin America, which is Brazil. Nearly half of these heavy hitters are in the Caribbean, and over half of them have Caribbean coastline. And Cuba is a puzzling one, actually, considering that, at least when we think about it from the American perspective, because we're not really allowed to travel there, at least as tourists. So it turns out, though, the rest of the world finds Cuba a great place to go. It's economical, easy to get to, safe, clean. It's got a lot going for it. I'll go through each of these countries in turn, describing what the draw is. Okay, and we'll start with Mexico. So as a destination, Mexico has 2 big draws. It has a coastline, and it has historical sites. So remember, from the last slide, there's over 20 million tourist arrivals in Mexico per year. It's declined a little bit because of some of the narco trafficking and drug violence problems that have been ongoing in Mexico over the last 2 or 3 years. but it's still very high, and there's big draws. One of the main reasons is the fact that it's probably got the largest mass tourism resort tourist type of infrastructure. So things like Cancun and Cozumel are well known globally as tourist destinations and feature some pretty incredible all-inclusive resorts. Now, I've never traveled to Cozumel, Cancun, or Acapulco, which is a Pacific Coast resort town, but I have spent time, not that much because I can't afford it, but I have spent time at two all-inclusive resorts in the Caribbean, and these places are pretty impressive. And so that kind of tourism is very popular in Mexico along the coasts. However, the beaches aren't the only draw for tourists, and the pre-colonial and colonial architecture and cultural kind of background are very important to tourism as well. So the churches, the monuments, and the prehistorical sites like the Incan and Mayan ruins are very popular with tourists as well. Next in the list, we had Brazil, with about $4.8 million worth of, or 4.8 million tourists arriving each year. And, there's kind of three big draws in Brazil. Like Mexico, Brazil's probably biggest draw is the beaches. And some of them are incredible for surfing. Oftentimes people think beach when they hear the word Brazil, right? Some places like Florianopolis, they're very seasonal. You can only have beach tourism really in the summer unless you're a hardcore surfer. Others like Rio and Recife can support it mostly year-round. So this is a shot that I took of the Ipanema beach in Rio, and it really is a beautiful beach. And the city butts right up next to it. I mean, it's a fantastic kind of environment to be in. Beaches aren't the only draw here, though, as well. Brazil sees a lot of cultural tourism, especially focused on its colonial cities like Tiradentes. This one here, this is Ouro Preto. And Salvador, which is on the coast, and it's African, indigenous, and European cultural celebrations like Carnival or Boi Bumbá, right? These kind of cities and culture are a big draw too. And then there's the draw of the Amazon. Here we actually have beachgoers on a tributary of the Amazon. And ecotourism taking off in Brazil, but still mainly attracts Europeans. So last time I was in one of the more major Brazilian cities, Brazilian Amazon cities, Manaus, I ran into over 30 backpackers, okay, all of them European. While in larger cities, that aren't in the Amazon, you'd see a much greater variety of tourists. If we keep moving down in the list, we see Puerto Rico with about 3.5 million tourists arriving each year. The draws here are similar. We have the coastline, beaches. They include things like snorkeling, scuba, charter fishing, and of course swimming. And it's attractive for U.S. residents because there's no special documentation. You don't need a passport. You don't need a visa to go there. And you can bring your guns. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, is subject to federal laws of the United States, even though it's its own nation. Okay, it's a commonwealth, right? And the history, the Spanish legacy, especially of the kind of Spanish gold trade, is very, very cool. And then it has El Yunque too. El Yunque is the site of the only U.S. domestic tropical moist forest research center. It's pretty impressive in its own right as well. That's what this is here. The Dominican Republic is next in the list with about 3.3 million tourist arrivals each year. Whoops. The Dominican is really, it's more about, even though the Dominican Republic is about more than tourism. Most Americans and Europeans travel there only for tourism and do so in all-inclusive resort travel package. So the draw is awesome beaches and pretty cheap tour packages, but there are some negative aspects as well that deal with security and also that you don't get to actually know much about the Dominican Republic if you're stuck in a guarded resort the whole time. Argentina is another big tourist destination as well. Two big draws here, but they're very different. Not so beach focused, right? So, it's focused far less on mass tourism and resort tourism and more on active or adventure tourism. So people who like to hike, ski, camp, and be outdoors tend to like the tourism options in Argentina and to a lesser extent Chile as well. Patagonia is a big draw. It's breathtakingly gorgeous, right? Here's a backpacking group in Patagonia. There's some interesting things that you have to think about as a tourist. Argentina is a place that's not really a good option for vegetarians. So I have a good vegan friend who went for 2 months to Argentina for adventure travel, and he lost 15 pounds because all he could eat at restaurants was white rice and plain beans, because everything else had meat in it, especially beef, right? The other draw, besides active tourism, adventure tourism in Argentina, is the historical sites and World Heritage sites. So there are a number of UN World Heritage sites, including natural features like Foz do Iguaçu, and human heritage sites as well, like historic Jesuit missions. And then Buenos Aires is actually increasingly a global city with incredible shopping. So some people will go for the kind of economic tourism of kind of shopping in a global city, right? And then, of course, we have Cuba. Cuba is a big draw as well, has a big draw of the beach. It's interesting, though, but it's also problematic. So if just as a refresher, Cuba had a communist revolution in 1955 that led to the seizure of resorts and properties which were focused on providing luxury tourism to North Americans and Europeans. And then other properties, of course, were seized too. But since then, Cuba's wealthy classes have fled, most of them to the U.S., where they continue to be a really strong group lobbying, although less so these days, for pressure on Cuba in the form of trade sanctions and travel restrictions, which it turns out don't actually apply to Cubans in many cases, Cubans that live in the U.S. Some Cubans went to Spain, and these folks influence policies in Europe to some extent as well. There's a lot of controversy as to how Cuba might reconcile with those who lost their property, which is actually probably the significant hurdle to opening up travel and trade sanctions against, to removing these sanctions against Cuba. So it's interesting, if you wanted to go to Cuba as a tourist now, it would be illegal for you, if you were an American citizen, to do so. But it's only illegal because, at least according to some view of this, because of the lobbying pressure of Cubans who fled the Communist Revolution in 1959. Understandably, that revolution was in 1959, and things have changed in Cuba. Raul Castro is now the acting president there, not his brother Fidel, who was the kind of primary revolutionary during the Communist Revolution, he and Che. And so policies have softened towards the U.S., and in turn, these kind of first-generation Cubans who fled the Communist Revolution to come to the U.S. have become older, and now their children are a little less, in some cases perhaps, strongly opinionated about putting sanctions on Cuba. Still a lot of controversy about reconciliation. It's moved forward under the Barack Obama administration, but kind of stalled out as other important world events have changed the focus, right? Still, Canadians and many Europeans can quite easily, and it turns out very cheaply, travel to Cuba and stay at resorts, even though many of which are government-owned and operated. Some of the Cuban tourism is actually for medical purposes, because Cuba's medical care is very good. And, pretty much the only hope of U.S. citizens who might want to go to Cuba is through tourism for education, which includes things like community service or study abroad, which you can actually do through ISU. So if you're ever interested, periodically, probably every other year or so, a trip from ISU goes to Cuba. Under the Bush administration, there was a kind of a crackdown on tourism, and that's relaxed somewhat under the Obama administration, but things are constantly in flux. Chile is another big destination. Similar to Argentina, it draws a lot of active tourists, and it has some of the best skiing, actually probably the best skiing in Latin America. You don't think of Latin America as a ski destination, but Chile has some fantastic fresh powder, right? Historical sites are pretty important as well, including some pretty famous ones. Easter Island is governed by Chile. It's one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, famous for stone heads, now for environmental devastation. In his book Collapse, Jared Diamond talks about Easter Island as a society that collapsed because of overconsumption. And it's a pretty common tourist destination now, but like the Galapagos of Ecuador, it's kind of hard to get to. It's way, way out in the Pacific Ocean. So overall, if we look at this, you notice how every destination I've described has some reliance on the natural environment to provide some of its tourism. So even beach resorts rely on the coastline. Most Latin American tourist destinations do rely on the natural environment to a significant extent. It's not like getting a tour of Hollywood or going to a bunch of museums, at least most of the time in Latin America. But there are some differences too, and they come from the two categories I mentioned earlier, ecotourism and mass tourism. So mass tourism in Latin America has some specific characteristics. For one, it tends to be done on a larger scale, including group travel, charter buses, multiple guides, stuff like that. What's more, there tends to be a set itineraries and limited interactions between tourists and the local people, and everything's prearranged. So the operation is primarily fixated on profit maximization, which is true of all industries for the most part. But sometimes that means individual attention can be thin, both to individuals in tour groups, but also attention to individual items that are of interest to tourists. Many of these are all-inclusive, which has pros and cons. Like the pros are you don't have to worry about things like where you'll get lunch or how you'll get to different tourist attractions that are separated by impenetrable city streets, like in Mexico or Rio. The cities are so huge, it's really tough to get from point A to point B. The tour company will take care of that. But the cons are things like you don't get to select what you eat. You don't get to select what stops you see, and they'll often take like the three biggest sites in a city like Mexico City and split them into 3 packages. So guess what you have to do? Buy all 3. You also are almost completely isolated from locals, except for the ones that run up to you and try to sell you something before the tour group leader tries to stop them. And you're also part of a big, unwieldy group that tends to be full of people. Can you tell I've done this before? Full of people who are either really fascinating or really, really irritating. It can be a very mixed bag experience. In Latin America, there are some mass tourism destinations. Cancun, Dominican Republic, and the islands of the Lesser Antilles, they all kind of focus on the beach tourism, and it includes things like all-inclusive resorts, Club Med, sandals, beaches. There's just a litany of these sorts of mass tourist destinations. There's some further drawbacks that often you don't think of as a mass tourist. You might be complaining about how the food's not very good and you wanted to eat Italian for lunch. But there's some other ones that are kind of bigger picture items, and they include things like damage to cultural and historic sites due to increased traffic and use. Resort tourism requires the development of fragile coastlines. So coastlines tend to be very biodiverse and environmentally important, and those areas are eliminated or irreparably changed. Water quality is often negatively impacted, and access to the beach is often privatized and limited, so locals don't get to use the beach anymore. The cultural social damage can be severe too, like workers in the hospitality sector is often living in bad conditions while they work in conditions of incredible wealth. So the response to these problems has been ecotourism, and it's been defined as responsible travel to natural areas which conserves the environment and sustains the well-being of local people. Sounds great. Sometimes described as sustainable, green, or alternative. Ecotourism is supposed to be an alternative, and it often includes, kind of interesting connections to the local community. It's a big growing area of investment in Latin America, and it really comes from these realizations as that mass tourism can cause damage. But this type of tourism has been build, kind of maybe oversold as the only way for true holistic development. So the betterment of local residents, which would encourage tourism by avoiding negative environmental impacts. And, you know, the strategies of ecotourism are usually pretty noble. They include more individualized or small group travel, independent arrangements, and an emphasis on being responsible and helping things, and maybe even being sustainable. But that doesn't mean that it has, it has universal benefits, right? There are some big ecotourism destinations. They include Ecuador, Belize, Costa Rica, Brazil. Dominican Republic has some ecotourism, and then Patagonia, both the Chile and Argentina areas. Mass and ecotourism are different, and they cater to different constituents, right? The needs of different people. Mass tourism, you're in groups rather than individuals. You tend to be arranging your travel through travel agencies in packages rather than independent kind of items. They tend to focus on the S's, so sun, seas, sand, rather than the T's, like trails, trekking, and travel to many destinations. Mass tourism tends to be more irresponsible in terms of environmental, social, and cultural conditions, whereas ecotourism tries to be a little bit more sensible. But there are problems with ecotourism, and they include things like conflicts over local environments. So, locals, if you were there using, say, an area like tropical forest for tourism, that means that locals can't cut down a tree, because that would make your opinion of, a forest, you wouldn't see what you were expecting to see, and that would be a negative tourism result, right? It opens places to exploitation that might have been left untouched otherwise, and some have claimed that ecotourism eventually leads to mass tourism as ecotourist destinations become more and more popular. One of Argentina's World Heritage Sites, Falls de Iguazu, that I showed you on the first slide, has become an ecotourist destination that is basically started as an ecotourist destination. Now it's mass tourism for sure. It's supposed to be environmentally friendly, but it's still profit-making exercises, which means that things can get shady. Not that they always do, but they have been known to. Expense is often an issue, so sometimes we'll describe this as a fad because only the wealthy can afford to do ecotourism, and then greenwashing is a problem. Greenwashing is when a company tries to make their product look environmentally friendly when it really isn't, or isn't as environmentally friendly as it's made out to be. So this happens when mass tourism is built as environmentally friendly as a marketing ploy. Overall, though, tourism is a very important economic component to Latin America's development, and it has really staged and kind of brought Latin America forward economically pretty substantially, especially in places like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, where tourism has really taken off over the last 50 years.